another installment of our tax talks, which is a series of discussions we usually have on not just tax, although the name is misleading because it's not about tax. It's on so many things. I think from food security now to things involving China. So it's quite the myriad of topics that we have discussed. And I think this is the 46th installment. Latif, correct me if I'm wrong on that. So welcome. Sorry, it's the what?
49th one.
49th. Wow. Okay. I think I've missed a couple of them. Yeah, but this is the 49th installment. Just maybe on a couple of house rules. Please ensure you mute yourself when not speaking, just to try and avoid any disruptions, and so that we can hear those who are speaking clearly. And then, of course, we welcome any questions and comments. You can indicate them in the chat, and then or you can raise your hand when we get to the questions and answers part after the professor's presentation. So maybe just to introduce what the Committee on Fiscal Studies is to those who are new, and to Professor Shahar. The Committee on Fiscal Studies is a multidisciplinary team of individuals that share similar interest in the field of taxation and include representatives from law, from business, and from the Institute of Development Studies and several other institutions of higher learning. It's actually the first step in a ladder to forming an African Institute of Fiscal Studies. So it's something that we are building up to. It was started by Professor Atia Waris, who is a professor at the University of Nairobi. And it includes a lot of researchers, young people such as myself and Latif, who have found quite the opportunity to engage in areas of research on very different topics. I'm a law student. I'm actually graduating next week, but I'm a law student myself. So, finding myself in areas of fiscal studies and taxation has been really interesting nonetheless. But now let's go to the reason why we're here, and that is Professor Shahar Hamedi, who is an associate professor of international politics and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. His work mainly examines security and development issues in Asia and the Pacific. He is a co-author most recently with Ali Jones of Fractured China, How State Transformation is Shaping China's Rise, which came out this year. His previous co-authored books include Governing Borderless Threats, which came out in 2015, and International Intervention and Local Politics, which came out in 2017, both published by Cambridge University Press. And if you'd like to engage more with the professor after this event, you can find him on Twitter at Shahar Hamedi, something he definitely will be doing. So now let's go to the book itself, which is quite an interesting read. In the book, Shahar Hamedi discusses here in his new co-authored book, Fractured China, How State Transformation is Shaping China's Rise. The book intervenes in the central debate in international relations today. Is China's rise a threat to the established international order? Fractured China shows that it depends what one means by China, for China is not the monolithic unitary actor that many assume. 40 years of state transformation, the fragmentation, decentralization, and internationalization of party-state apparatuses have profoundly changed how its foreign policy is made and implemented. Today, Chinese behavior abroad is often not the product of a coherent grand strategy, but results from sometimes chaotic struggle for power and resources among contending political business interests within a surprisingly permissive Chinese-style regulatory state. Presenting a path-breaking new analytical framework, Fractured China transforms the central debate in international relations and provides new tools for scholars and policymakers seeking to understand and respond to 21st century rising powers. Drawing on extensive fieldwork in China and Southeast Asia, 3 major case studies, the South China Sea, non-traditional security cooperation, and development financing, demonstrates the framework's explanatory power. The book is available, I think, is out already, so you can find it wherever you I think on Amazon. I think it's on Amazon as well. So definitely I would advise anybody who's interested in this issue relating to China to definitely check out the book. But anyway, enough about me talking. I think we all want to hear from the professor. So maybe Latif, now you can put on the PowerPoint slides, and then Professor, you can start whenever you're ready. But thank you for coming. We hope to learn a lot from you. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks for your kind introduction, Nasri, and thank you to the committee for organizing this talk. We often lament the way in which the pandemic has prevented us from traveling and going to places and meeting people and speaking about our work. But actually, maybe one of the silver linings of the situation we're in is that it has made these kinds of interactions a bit more common. I've never had the chance to speak to anyone at the University of Nairobi before, and it is really great to do that. Mostly my travel before has been to Asia and the region in which I live and work. So I'm very pleased to be able to do that, and thank you so much for inviting me. I hope that at some point in the not too distant future we can actually meet in the real world and continue the conversation. But for now, this is good to be able to do. Yeah, Nasri mentioned if you can just upload the screen. Is it uploaded? Because I can't see it on my screen. I'm just asking. Yeah, we've had some technical problems for those of you who weren't here before. Yeah, so the book came out recently. It was funded by an Australian Research Council Discovery Project grant. I should probably note that. It was generously funded. Yeah, I can see it now. So thank you very much for that. And it was co-authored with Lee Jones from Queen Mary University of London, with whom I've actually worked for many years now, including on the book that Nasri mentioned before, Governing Borders Threats, which we also worked on together. So I'm presenting this today on behalf of both of us, because we worked on this book, really from the very beginning together, and it's the product of both of our efforts. So if you get a chance to at some point invite Lee or speak to him as well, I'm sure he'd be delighted to be in contact with you. Slide, please. Thank you. So as Nasri said in the introduction, the book intervenes in the big debate in international relations about what's going to happen to the international order with China's rise. We've seen China's quite remarkable economic rise from a very poor developing country to becoming the world's second biggest economy, and in purchasing power parity terms, probably the world's biggest economy. And scholars have been debating for quite a long time what that actually means. Now, I'd like to start the talk today with a little vignette that's actually in the book, and it's one of a number of vignettes where we illustrate the problem that got us thinking about the book, what we're actually saying and arguing in this book. And that vignette is China's record on non-proliferation and its relationship with North Korea. So I'm sure many people in the audience know that North Korea has been testing, has managed to, by most accounts, develop nuclear weapons over the last, say, 20 years through a number of different experiments and testing of both missiles and actual nuclear devices. And because of that, it's been subjected to quite a lot of international sanctions, usually organized by the United Nations Security Council. So we have a very perhaps mystifying situation in China's relations with North Korea. On the one hand, we see Beijing, the Chinese government, supporting these sanctions, signing up to these sanctions, tightening sanctions on North Korea, but also taking some very concrete steps. For instance, North Korea is not a member of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It was excluded because of these sanctions. It is also not a member of the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So these are fairly concrete steps that demonstrates the seriousness with which the Chinese government takes the sanctions of North Korea. But then on the other hand, we have what appears to be a contradictory situation where Chinese investment, despite these sanctions in North Korea, has actually risen quite substantially over the same period. So we see investment rising from 1.1 million in 2003 all the way up to 110 roughly million in 2012. In the period between 2013 to 2017, when sanctions were supposed to have been tightened even further, we see investment rising even more to 209 million over that period. Additionally, what we find also in the same period is exports of apparel, generally Chinese companies working within North Korea to China rising, again, quite substantially from 186 million in 2010 to nearly 800 million in 2015. And this accounts for about a third of North Korea's export to China. So we see essentially parts of North Korea being integrated into supply chains led by Chinese companies across the border. So what is happening here? What we're seeing, and sorry, I should also mention, we also see local authorities easing tourism and trade restrictions periodically, allowing people across the border, again in contravention of United Nations sanctions. Unsurprisingly, as these things are happening, the United States, and specifically President Trump, when he was in power, blasting China for undermining the UN sanctions, claiming that China is doing one thing, but saying one thing, but doing another. So this is an example of contradictory behavior. Slide, please. Slide, please, sorry. Thank you. But this is one of many, many examples of what someone has termed China's consistently inconsistent international behavior. There are many examples of Chinese international behavior towards North Korea. And North Korea, I think we can all agree, is a very important international relation for China. This is a nuclear powered neighboring state. And yet we find this quite inconsistent behavior in how China engages with North Korea. Within the field of international relations, which is the one that I engage with and Lee engaged with the most, this is actually quite problematic because the assumptions of the field is that states are actors. States are seen as agents, actors in international politics. So there is an assumption that China is a unitary actor. It's a single actor that is just doing things in international politics. So what that leads to, this really fundamental assumption of international relations, is to scholars, if you like, shoehorning evidence or ignoring evidence that doesn't fit their preferred theoretical models in order to support their theoretical assumptions. So when there is inconsistent behavior, they deal with it still within how their theoretical frameworks perceive international states to act internationally. So for example, and I don't know how many scholars of or students of international relations are present at this call, but realists, which are probably the most, or used to be at least the most influential group within international relations, they assume a world in which states are fighting for survival and essentially always existing in zero-sum relations with one another. They assume states are unitary actors that are seeking to maximize their national interests. So what they see is a gap between China's formal commitments on North Korea and actual Chinese behavior. For them, they explain that as a manifestation of China's grand strategy. So there is some kind of hidden grand strategy that we're not aware of, and China is just playing some kind of a long game that combines, participating in sanctions on the one hand, but on the other hand, enabling North Korea in order to keep North Korea as some kind of a buffered state between itself and South Korea, where American forces are based, or some other assumption about Chinese grand strategy. Now, international relations liberals, they see relation between states as more positive sum, not necessarily zero sum. They're likely to play up the potential for cooperation. So they're not obviously, but in this case, they would emphasize China's need for cooperation and focus on the possibility of China essentially participating in international framework to control North Korea. So what that has led to within international relations, this big debate about what are the implications of China's rise. What these attempts to manage theoretically consistently inconsistent behavior, they've led to what is increasingly an inconclusive and speculative debate. Because no one really knows what is really happening behind the scene, essentially scholars are reverting back to the underlying assumptions of their theory. Those like realists who presume that international relations is more conflictual emphasize the more conflictual elements of China's behavior. Those like liberals that perceive international relations to be potentially more cooperative then emphasize the more cooperative elements of China's international behavior. So instead of thinking about what China is, they're thinking more about what China would become based on what they assume states to be like as part of their theories. So it's highly speculative. We don't actually get a clear answer for why we have this inconsistent behavior. But a deeper dive that was done by people that know the circumstances of Chinese-North Korean relations a bit better have actually argued that Chinese non-compliance with sanctions is actually driven largely by firms, companies that are based in border areas, and also by provincial governments close to North Korea, attempting to essentially improve their own commercial circumstances in most cases, or acting on some kind of other local agendas. And Beijing has actually been largely reactive to these actions of these local actors. So this is a rather different perspective to the one that is offered by these really big international relation theories and their assumptions about how states work. Slide, please. So our argument in the book, and this is taken directly from page 3 of the book, is actually a rather simple one on one level. What we're arguing is that China's international engagements today are often inconsistent or even contradictory, because China is not actually a unitary international actor. As actually Nasri said at the beginning, what we find is a decades of state transformation, and I'll explain that to you in a moment, involving the fragmentation, transformation, and the internationalization of party-state apparatuses. Sorry about all the big words there, by the way. I'm going to break it down in a moment. What they mean is that actually there are many Chinese actors now operating in international politics, and these actors are not always coordinated, they don't always share the same interests, and often they do things in contradiction to one another. So this is actually how we explain, and we provide evidence in the book to substantiate the claim, China's inconsistent international behavior. It's not that there's some kind of an underlying secret strategy or there's some kind of an underlying real China that we need to uncover through our examination of the evidence. Rather, the evidence points to the existence of many Chinese actors operating internationally today. Slide, please. Now, what the book tries to do, I already discussed with you the international relations perspective. The book tries to bridge the gap between the expert studies of China, what you may call sinology, and international relations. Because what I just told you now is actually not at all surprising to experts on China. In fact, China experts have been documenting China's party states, fragmentation, decentralization, and sometimes even uneven internationalization for many, many years. In fact, there are books going back to the 80s and the 90s that have already been discussing these dynamics within Chinese governance. And we find all sorts of titles or concepts like fragmented authoritarianism and so on that discuss essentially the kinds of things that we're talking about, we're talking about in the book that I'm talking about today as well. That China's party state is not a single actor that has a single mind and that works in a perfectly coordinated way. They've been talking about this for a long time. But there is this really significant contrast between what they've been talking about and what we find in the field of international relations, which is the one that's most concerned with the impact of China's rise internationally. There we find titles like China's Grand Strategy, etc. A lot of these books are focusing on grand strategy, uncovering the underlying big story behind everything that China does. Slide, please. And more recently, there are actually, and one more, please. There are books like these two that actually The Long Game was just released that actually discuss a very long-term detailed plan that the Chinese leadership is pursuing in a very coordinated and deliberative manner. In one case, even on the right-hand side there, you can see Michael Pillsbury's arguing there's a 100 years plan. So these are quite different images to the one that you get if you look at the China Studies scholarship. Slide, please. So why is this disconnect between what sinologists, the China experts, have been saying for a long time, and what international relations scholars and actually many policymakers think about China? Why is this disconnect? This is something that we actually grappled with as we're working on the book. The reason, to some extent, from the sinology side, is because they tend to operate like many area studies expert. You know, I don't know how well you know academic silos, but academic silos are very real. And they tend to work within the silo of China studies. They write mainly for each other. They treat what's happening in China, like China's reform and opening up process, as sui generis. And they generally employ very little theory they do very little theoretical development. And generally do very little comparative study as well. So they don't do a lot of comparison between what's happening in China, for instance, and what's happening in other countries. They're just focused on what's happening in China. They're interested in the detail. And also, so far, they've lacked a theory from international relations that they can harness to communicate their empirical findings to the IR discipline. So they continue to basically just talk to each other and talk about what's happening in China, but they don't really make a big impact beyond that field. On the international relations side, we have a bigger problem, and that's to do with the essential, like really basic ontological commitments of IR scholars. So in IR and international relations, most scholars are strongly committed to the idea that states are actors. And these assumptions are very powerful within the rising powers debate, even to the point of ignoring parts of international relations scholarship that do talk about some of the things that we're interested in, but they just assume that these things do not apply to China because China as a rising power is this tightly controlled top-down authoritarian system. Also, theories that are interested in international relations in how foreign policy is made, like foreign policy analysis or FPA or bureaucratic politics and so on, these approaches generally are not actually doing a very good job of tying the domestic, what's happening inside China, to the international. Particularly, they take very little account of the fragmentation of Chinese governance. So that is why we basically have these two fields, that's fine, you can leave it there, operating basically in complete isolation almost from each other, where the insights of one don't influence the other. So what we're trying to do in this book actually is to take a lot of those insights that sinologists have developed for decades. Some of these things, like I said, go back to the 80s. Try to take some of that and develop a framework that we can actually bring these ideas to bear on the big international relations debate on rising powers. What's going to happen with China's rise, okay? And that brings me to discuss the underlying theoretical framework of the book, which actually builds on pre-existing work that Lee Jones and I have done in many years, and we call that the state transformation approach, or the STA, if you like, if you're into acronyms. So the foundation of the state transformation approach is Gramscian state theory that builds on the work of Antonio Gramsci, as this is a state theory, state theoretical approach, as initially associated with Antonio Gramsci and developed later by subsequent theorists, especially Nikos Boulantzis and Bob Jessup. And essentially, Gramsci's basic insight was that state and civil society were actually not separate domains, and power relations operating across both of them shape how the state works. So the underlying assumption here is that states are not things, they're not just institutions, they're fundamentally a power relation. They're reflecting the power and interests of particular groups in society over other groups, and they do so systematically. So different states would manifest different constellations of power, and consequently would be prioritizing the interests of particular social groups over others. So states are not similar like this, but the fundamental state theory applies to all states, okay? So in order to understand how states work, we need to understand the underlying power relations. Who are the social forces that are operating in each state, and what access they have to the state, and how their power is exercised through the state. This is the fundamental theoretical starting point here. From this perspective, what state transformation refers to is not just changes in institutions of the state, although that's a big part of it. So state institutions are changing, how they relate to each other are changing, and so on. But it's more than that. What it reflects is actually a fundamental shift in how power is organized and exercised through the state, including through changes in institutions, but sometimes it could also involve the same institutions just doing things differently. Now, state transformation from this perspective is not a new thing, but we are talking specifically in this book about a particular process of state transformation that began roughly from the 1970s, and it involves a shift from what you may call a period where states were more nationally organized into states that, largely as a result of globalization, have actually transformed into, if you like, more transnationalized states. So they, the nature of the social relations underpinning state power are not as tightly confined to particular territorial borders. And these changes are worldwide. They take different guises in different countries. I'm going to talk about the Chinese context specifically here, but they reflect significant changes in the underlying political economy from circumstances that enabled, especially in the post-World War II era, various forms of national control and national development to circumstances where those forms of development are more difficult to achieve and involve engaging essentially in transnational economic flows. So in China specifically, how this manifests is in the shift from Maoism, the kind of form of socialist state-led development, autarkic development under Maoism, to capitalism, from the state-led capitalism, of course, from the late 1970s, and also the underlying changing class basis of the party state in that period. So the party was a party of peasants and workers, and it became a party of what we call the kind of capitalist class. I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. What happened specifically, the way in which it manifests in terms of changes to the state's institutions, is through processes of fragmentation, decentralization, and internationalization. So fragmentation, essentially in this context, refers to the way in which policy-making authority is sort of fragmenting, if you like, horizontally between a lot of different agencies that are doing the same thing. And we find that, I'll give you an example later on from the book itself, but we find that in China, sometimes you have many, many, many different agencies essentially responsible for roughly the same kind of stuff. So it's highly fragmented in practice. Like you may find 11 agencies responsible for maritime security, or similar kinds of situations across different policy areas. Decentralization is also very important, and that is the shifting of authority and to some extent fiscal capacity to China's provinces especially, but to subnational governments more generally. So from the 1980s into the 1990s, China experimented with various forms of decentralization, allowing essentially subnational governments, provincial governments, to participate, to run their own economic policies, of course, but also participate relatively directly in international politics. Now, these processes of fragmentation and decentralization have also combined with internationalization. And what that means here is that agencies that emerge, like provinces, like state-owned companies, like regulators, that initially emerged to be operating in a strictly domestic context, increasingly got access directly into international politics. They are now operating in international space. For example, state-owned companies, as many people in Africa would know, are now operating in Africa, signing deals with governments or building things on the ground, and similar processes are happening in other parts of the world. So these are the basic ways in which the state has transformed, the party state in China has transformed, reflecting the changing social basis and the shift from Maoism to capitalism. Slide, please. So given this underlying changes, what we're interested in the book is to understand how power is exercised in this fragmented, internationalized, and decentralized party state. Under Mao, power was more directly exercised in more hierarchical ways from the top, controlled through line forms of control all the way down and controlling things like even just small expenses that maybe a local government would want to, like, I don't know, purchasing of stationery. Some of those decisions had to be controlled from the top. But what we have now is a very, very different situation. Now, what we're trying to avoid, as we understand how the Chinese party state works, is binary more or less questions of a lot of sinology literature. So what I mean by that is a lot of the literature on China's transformation is obsessed with the question of whether power is decentralized or still controlled from the center. And that leads to very binary arguments. It's either decentralized or controlled from the center. Now, if you look at it like that, you might end up arguing that power is centralized, remains centralized, because the center continues to exercise considerable power over other actors within the Chinese party system. So if you're working through binaries, you might miss out on the significance of what is going on. But we're not interested in arguing whether it's all decentralized or it's all centralized. What we're actually trying to do is understand how power is exercised in a party state system where you don't have these more hierarchical forms of control that we used to have before. So what we're arguing is that we're seeing the emergence of what we call the Chinese-style regulatory state. So regulatory state is a concept that's not unique to China. Actually, it emerges from political science work, largely in the European state, but also in other states around the world. And the basic idea of the regulatory state is that in a regulatory state, rather than the center command and control, exercising command and control authority over other actors within the system, what they try to do is coordinate and steer what is otherwise a relatively loosely coordinated and fragmented set of actors. Okay, so this is the basic argument about the regulatory state. Now, in China, this regulatory state system operates within the context of China, which is actually quite different from, say, a European state. And therefore, we needed to get more specific and look at how it operates in China. So what we find in Chinese context is that the center regulates and controls the system, or attempts to control the system, via what we call regulatory mechanisms rather than through top-down control. Okay, they very rarely command directly subordinates to do things in this way. What they provide are broad regulatory mechanisms. And there are 5 mechanisms that we recognize in the book. The first one is party ideology and campaigns. So leaders try to shape how people think about various issues by changing the party's ideology or running various campaigns. We see that at the moment with things like Xi Jinping's thought on socialism and a new era, and similar sort of tweaks to party ideology. That's not the first one. There are other ones in the past, like Jiang Zemin's Free Represents, and previously, there are other changes like Deng Xiaoping's socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is basically a term for the shift to capitalism. So these are tweaks to party ideology, try to kind of shift how the multitude of China's party state thinks about something. A related mechanism is senior leaders' statements and slogans. So senior leaders essentially try to shape what's going on by issuing relatively vague statements and slogans. We find that in a lot of our case studies. For instance, in the case of the South China Sea, we see statements like, trying to find a balance between asserting Chinese power in the region and balancing against, conflict in the region. Or, if you can see, probably a better example would be the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road is more of a brand. It's a kind of slogan rather than a clear plan, okay? The third mechanism through which the center tries to regulate what's happening in the Chinese party state is multi-agencies, local small group, and commissions. So trying to bring in people from different parts of the party state to talk together and work things out. A lot of the time, these are more like coordinating bodies rather than decision-making bodies, and generally they try to basically align how different elements think about something. The party state also, the center of the party state also exercises control over laws, regulations, and funding, and it can use that in order to shape how everyone else behaves. But probably the most important regulatory mechanism is the Chinese Communist Party's own power of appointments, appraisal, and discipline. And we know that the party has, it can shape how cadres who want to get promoted act. It can shape their incentive structures. But also, if people stray too far from what the center leadership wants, there are party disciplinary mechanisms, and these mechanisms can be quite harsh. People can often be jailed or even executed, and that obviously shapes how they behave, right? Now, none of these mechanisms is actually fully successful ever at just unifying the party state around a particular position and coordinating action in a perfect way, because they're also impacted, their implementation and practice is impacted by the responses from other actors from below, some subordinates within the Chinese party state. And these take three forms, which we call the three I's. They're influencing, interpreting, and ignoring. So subordinate actors, let's say provincial governments, can try and influence what central agencies or the top leadership is doing about something. And we've seen that happening in many cases through various forms of lobbying, for instance, trying to shape what, for instance, something like the Belt and Road Initiative looks like. Perhaps the most important mechanism is interpreting. Because a lot of the Chinese party leadership statements are fairly vague rather than clearly laid out plans, others within the system can often interpret these statements in ways that serve their own interests while still claiming to be serving what the top leadership would want them to do. That is a very, very common mechanism. We see that happening all the time, including in the cases that I'll describe to you. Finally, but less commonly, we see the response of ignoring. In some cases, actors within the wider party state would actually ignore what the top leadership is saying and try to keep doing what they're doing. That is obviously a risky strategy, but it does happen. So instead of going back to my initial point, instead of saying the power is always decentralized or always centralized, what we find is this kind of process that is never ending of negotiation, contestation, cooperation that shapes how every policy how policy in every area pretty much in China is being made, involving all of these, the use of mechanisms of control, but also responses from other actors. So it's more of a kind of ongoing process that in some cases is a bit more centralized, in other cases is more decentralized, but it's more of a process rather than a determined endpoint. Slide, please. This slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so just briefly, I suppose, before we move on to discuss the case studies, what does it actually tell us about the international relations argument about grand strategy? Well, according to work that tried to specify what grand strategy actually means, which involves long-term vision, holistic devotion of state resources, prioritization of key interests and goals, and so on, the way the Chinese regulatory state operates actually, pretty much in every case, militates against the emergence and implementation of grand strategy. What we find instead is actually fairly loose and often incoherent and even contradictory behaviors, generally underneath fairly loose brands, if you like harmonious world, national rejuvenation, and core interests, for example. So our book actually quite explicitly argues against IR's perceptions of Chinese grand strategy. Next slide, please. Okay, so far I've been talking about China, but we're also interested in how this process that operates within China then interacts with what's happening in other countries in the book. So we argue that to explain the final outcomes, what we need to do is how these dynamics of state transformation in China then intersect with similar dynamics happening in other countries. And that's probably where the framework is also relevant, for instance, to people who are interested in what's happening in Africa, because you can use the same framework to study how Chinese actors engage in Africa as well. We don't do that in the book. We look at the Asia and the Pacific. So essentially, what we need to do if we look at other countries, I mean, other countries we understand through the same state theory. We also don't understand them as monolithic unitary actors. We see them as riven with conflict, different interests, different social forces vying for power. So what we need to do is we need to identify these actors, their interests and their agendas using the same kind of analysis that we employed in the Chinese case. And then we need to look at how these interests within these recipient countries then relate to what Chinese actors' interests and agendas are doing in their own countries and what outcomes emerge out of that. Now, clearly, what is happening in many cases is often contested because Chinese interventions or engagements of various kinds would have different impacts on different interests within the recipient societies. Some people would benefit from them, others won't. Okay, some would really want to see them happen, others won't. So this is precisely what we're trying to do, is map out how the kind of fragmented, decentralized Chinese party state then interacts with similar dynamics in the recipient states and their societies. And of course, as I mentioned before, each state and society are a little bit different, so we need to be attuned to these differences. Slide, please. In the book, we demonstrate the framework through three main case studies. The first one is the South China Sea, which is, if you like, a hard security case study. This is one of the world's most potentially combustible regions because of China's territorial claims in the region and competing claims from other countries. We also demonstrated through a case study of international development financing. And this is, again, something that may be of particular interest to the people who are listening to this presentation. And especially what we look at is how China's development financing, specifically in the context of hydropower dams on the Mekong, through the cases of Cambodia and Myanmar. Slide, please. But the case that I'll be talking about today is the one in the middle, and that is the case of the Chinese efforts to manage non-traditional security concerns, specifically counter-narcotics operations and banditry on the Mekong in Southeast Asia. Slide, please. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about one aspect of this case study. I really don't have time to go much more than that. As you can understand, there's a real wealth of empirical findings in the book, and I can spend a whole day talking about those specifically. So I just pulled out one of those, and even that is not the full case study. It's just 1/3 of what's happening in that particular chapter. So I would encourage people to actually go and read if they're interested to discover further. And I'm focusing on Chinese counter-narcotics operation in the Mekong. Some of you would know that China borders parts of the world that are known as the Golden Triangle, which are some of the most active drug production and trafficking regions on the planet, right? So the conventional narrative about what's happening in China's relations with that Golden Triangle region is that China is experiencing a problem of opium, heroin, and amphetamine type stimulants or methamphetamines arriving in China from the Golden Triangle region, from North Myanmar and Laos. And this is a transnational threat to China. Now, what the Chinese have done consequently to deal with the threat is they securitize the flow of drugs. They're treating it as a security problem. They've declared a people's war on drug. There was a national campaign issued by Hu Jintao, then president of China. Actually, there's a mistake. There should be 2005, not 2000, and I apologize for that. And then after Hu Jintao declared the national people's war on drug, there was a coordinated rollout of opium substitution projects to give development alternatives to drug-producing neighboring states. The idea is that, instead of growing heroin, they'll be growing other crops that are going to give them an income, so they're not going to need the income from opium. And additionally, China has also participated actively in the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, UNODC, MOU on drug control in the Mekong. incorporating the United Nations principles on alternative development. So these are the principles that shape how you do opium substitution programs. And much of the existing literature on this particular Chinese intervention then praises the success of China's opium substitution programs and says that it's been quite effective. Now, this is kind of easy to understand from a realist or a liberal perspective. So a realist would say, well, there was a transnational threat identified. China acted to deal with that threat. A liberal would emphasize the international cooperation that China has participated in, because drugs are seen as a shared problem. So there was an interest in all the countries to come together and deal with it as a shared problem. So these are kind of the conventional perspectives on this particular issue. But we're not dealing here with the conventional perspectives. We're putting forward the state transformation perspective. Slide, please. So from a state transformation analysis, the picture looks somewhat different. The first thing is that rather than being initiated from the top, because of Hu Jintao's national war on drugs and all the rest of it, actually the history of the opium substitution programs is very, very bottom up, and actually reflects the dynamics of influencing that I mentioned before. So basically we have a county within Yunnan province, which is the Chinese province that borders those countries in Southeast Asia, starting an opium substitution program already back in the 1990s, and then convincing the provincial government to take it up as a provincial plan. And then the province lobbied the national government or national agencies to make it, a national plan. So what we're seeing here actually is a process of influencing, reflecting the decentralization of policymaking within China. Now, it also clearly manifests the process of fragmentation. The way in which national drug policy making happens in China is highly fragmented. Okay, we find at the very least 41 agencies that we're able to count that are involved in drug policy making in China. Notionally, the Ministry of Public Security is the lead agency. This is like the kind of ministry that's responsible for the Chinese police, okay, the Ministry of Public Security. Notionally, that's the lead agency domestically, and it is also the lead agency representing China in many of the United Nations processes. Okay, and generally speaking, that reflects again the kind of regulatory framework that we talked about before. So Ministry of Public Security has developed regulatory standards and various things, and it tried to disseminate those to the other agencies that are involved in drug policymaking in China and implementation. But things get even more complicated than that, because for the opium substitution program, which we focus on in this chapter, actually, there's a whole different process which is not even connected to the process that the Ministry of Public Security is leading. And that is known as the 122 work group, which also involves 21 different agencies. Now here, rather than the Ministry of Public Security being in charge, we find that the Ministry of Commerce is in charge. And this is the regulatory mechanism that was set up to manage opium substitution programs. But even this regulatory mechanism that is led by the Ministry of Commerce, which indicates, of course, that commercial motivations are far more important here than security motivation, given the lead agency. Even that process actually is completely disconnected with what the Ministry of Public Security is doing in the other process. Instead of looking at, how to deal with opium growing regions in a very targeted way, it only issued broad targets about the number of hectares or acres that need to be planted with alternative crops. The United Nations principles on how to do development through opium substitution programs have also been entirely neglected in favor of these commercial motivations. Now, beneath that, this is the national regulatory mechanism, which is providing funding for opium substitution programs. But the actual implementation again reflects the dynamics of the Chinese-style regulatory state, because that has again been decentralized to the Department of Commerce within Yunnan. And I'm sorry if people are being confused by all this, because it is really confusing. I mean, these are very complicated, rather nebulous, often dysfunctional regulatory processes, but that is precisely the point that I'm trying to make. So the implementation was actually decentralized to Yunnan's Department of Commerce. So it was provincialized, brought down to the provincial level. And that agency, again, remember the 3 I's that I mentioned before, is interpreting what that means to the opium substitution program around the dominant business interests based in Yunnan, and is basically ignoring what the Ministry of Public Security wants and what the United Nations guidelines say it should be doing. Instead of thinking about all these lovely things about how to do alternative development, what it is focusing on is how to benefit Yunnan-based agribusiness companies. Especially important are rubber growing firms. Now, rubber has a long history in Yunnan. It's a very important crop going back to, the early days of Maoism, and these companies are very well connected to the provincial government in Yunnan, and essentially the program ended up being organized around their interests, not about all the other objectives, including reducing drug growing in the Golden Triangle region. So these party state-linked businesses then internationalize as the actual implementing agencies. They're the ones on the ground talking to people in Myanmar and in Laos and actually making opium substitution happen in reality. It was all led by the companies with very minimal supervision, both at the provincial level and at the national level. And it's very clear that their commercial interests to actually enrich themselves through that process were far more important than strategic ones, and absolutely more important than the objective of reducing the opium production in the Golden Triangle. The reason we know this, by the way, is because the crop that was selected for opium substitution, like I said before, rubber, is actually entirely inadequate as a substitute for opium. At a very basic level, it grows at a different altitude. So you cannot replace opium with rubber. It's just not possible. Okay, so the altitude in which you grow opium are roughly from 800 to 1800 meters. Rubber is generally grown at lower altitudes, around 900 meters. They're not actually comparable crops. You can't replace one with the other. But that indicates that what was actually shaping the program was what the companies wanted done, and they wanted to find plantations for rubber. Slide, please. Now, as I mentioned before, the outcomes of this campaign reflect the intersection of Chinese actors' interests and agendas with those in the target state. And the context in Myanmar is really important here. So Myanmar, for those of you who knows, actually is the site for some of the world's longest running civil wars, especially in the borderlands areas around the border with China. And many of these ethnic armed groups have been active for many, many decades and fighting with the national government and the military, which actually dominates the government. Now, for many years, for several years now, the ethnic armed groups have been, in some cases, coming into agreement with the national government and the military, which has come to be known as Ceasefire Capitalism, and that allows basically different groups to exploit the natural resources that are in the region and essentially displace the local populations and benefit a very narrow set of interests, both involving the military and the ethnic armed groups. Now, essentially, the process that happened before the start of China's opium substitution program was that the national military, through a campaign of concerted attack on the ethnic armed groups, brought some of them into the fold, like I mentioned before, and some of them were not in the fold, and used opium eradication or attack on their capacity to produce and distribute drugs as a way of essentially getting them to sign a ceasefire. Groups that signed the ceasefire with the national government and the military would typically allow to just continue growing drugs and doing whatever it is they want to do, as long as they weren't fighting the military. Into this context comes the Chinese OSP, the Opium Substitution Program. So what happens in practice is the Chinese agribusinesses looking to increase their capacity to grow rubber within Myanmar, they then partner with local elites generally either from the military or the ethnic minority groups or ethnic armed groups. And together they exercise very substantial land grabbing, forced displacement of local populations, sometimes even forced labor and proletarianization in order to expand their rubber plantations in that part of the world. All of this is in violation of the United Nations principle that China notionally signed up to through the Ministry of Public Security. So the outcome of this, unsurprisingly, is that a very narrow elite, both within the Chinese firms, but also within Myanmar, is enriched by these activities. They become wealthier. But opium cultivation actually rises. It rises because a lot of these activities push people off their land and undermine the sources of income, and therefore they had to find other sources of income, and they went into opium cultivation. Slide, please. So this is pretty clear from these graphs that are in the book. The area that's highlighted in yellow is the area that's the time period in which the Chinese opium substitution program happened. And as you can see, drug cultivation was actually going down for a while, and that was because of the military's ceasefire agreements and attacks on the ethnic armed minority groups where the drugs are being grown. But actually, you can see that subsequent to China's opium substitution program, drug production actually began rising again, as were seizures by Chinese authorities. So actually, the opium substitution program achieved the opposite result of what they're meant to achieve. Slide, please. I'm not going to go through these statements, but basically, for those who are interested, you can have a look later. These are statements from people that we interviewed in Myanmar that are basically noting that their own experience confirms our argument in the book, and that is that the Chinese authorities, both in Yunnan and nationally, often did not have any idea what their companies were doing and the kinds of activity they're involved in. So I'm just going to skip that. Slide, please. And again. Okay, so I just gave you a bit of a flavor of what's in the book in terms of the different case studies and specifically focused on the counter narcotics case. But like I said, it was only a small part of it because actually the case also looks at what happens in Laos, not just in Myanmar, and also looks at anti-banditry activities on the Mekong River itself. And I didn't even talk about those. And then there are other two case studies. So let me just finish by briefly talking about the book's key findings. The first finding is that the degree of policy coherence in Chinese foreign policy making actually varies quite substantially between different areas of policy. And we created this kind of matrix, the 4 quadrants that essentially create 4 kinds of Chinese foreign policy making, depending on the level of coherence. And these map out to different case studies that we talk about in the book. Now, what that means, and I don't want to get into the detail here, although I'm happy to pick it up in Q&A, what that means is that we can't treat all areas, all policy making that emanates from China in the same way. We need to identify the particular dynamics and the degree of coherence that exists in different policy areas, which is shaped by 2 basic things: the alignment of interests of the actors involved, to what extent their interests are aligned, and the application and efficiency of the coordinating mechanisms that the center employs. Slide, please. Our second key finding is that actually China's regulatory state, although it's not necessarily controlled from the top, it doesn't necessarily mean it's safer than a state that acts in that kind of very coordinated way in which many people understand it to act. Because we often find that some of the worst behaviors, some of the most dangerous behaviors exhibited by Chinese actors are actually actors, if you like, going rogue, you know, like companies doing really nasty things like what's happened in Myanmar that I just described to you. We also have evidence of Chinese fishing militias, you know, creating all sorts of chaos in the South China Sea. Hainan province also acting to maximize its control over the South China Sea and therefore, again, antagonizing neighboring states. So sometimes this fragmentation can actually be quite dangerous. Okay, so this is not some kind of a story of, well, China is not a unitary actor, therefore it's great. Actually, sometimes we can find that this fragmentation that we describe in the book can be more dangerous. Finally, the book shows that the role of the targets or the recipients of Chinese international engagements is actually critical for understanding what happens in practice. In all of our case studies, we found that what recipients do, their interests, actors, agents, the agency of their governments, all these things matter greatly for the outcome of Chinese international engagements. And that means that we shouldn't only look at China, we should also look at what other countries are doing when they are engaging with China. So from a policymaking point of view, what that means is there is essentially no one-size-fits-all policy toward China. You need to take a granular approach, look at particular policy areas, look at the actors involved, look at what they're trying to do, look at how they relate to each other. And you need to develop responses that take seriously the role of the states with which China engages. Slide, please. Thank you. So that basically is the end of my presentation. You can find, if you are interested in learning about it more, if obviously we'll go to Q&A now. I'll be very happy to take your questions. But if you'd like to purchase the book came out in hardback, paperback, and ebook. And if you use this discount code, if you go to Cambridge University Press website, you can get a 20% discount. Although you can also just ask your institution if the library has the budget to just purchase the book, and then you can all get access to it. So you probably had enough or more than enough hearing me speak. So now I'm looking forward to getting some feedback from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was an interesting presentation and tries to condense the main ideas of the book into a short presentation. So thank you for that. I think now we would like to go to the Q&A session. So for this time, I will maybe start by asking you a couple of questions based on the book and also perhaps on some of your past literature. Then I think for those in the audience who would like to also ask a question, indicate it in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and then I shall call upon you to ask your question. So maybe
please
just
don't
to
be shy. Just ask a question. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Definitely don't be shy. So maybe I would like maybe to just move to the BRI issue. Just for a little while, and how it wasn't really a grand strategy. It was sort of different actors doing different things, and the rest of the world kind of assumed this is the edict from above that is now going down to the bottom. But there's this quote in your book. Allow me to read. Policymakers and civil society organizations in the West and recipient countries should stop responding to the BRI as though it were a well-planned grand strategy and recognize it for what it is, an often fragmented, messy, and poorly governed set of development projects. What is needed is not so much a geopolitical pushback against the BRI, but the introduction of more selective interventions to improve transparency around and the governance of mega projects supported by the provision of alternative forms of development financing. Now, this was quite interesting to me because it so happens, I think 6 days ago or a week or there ago, Europe came about with its own BRI, if I can call it that. I think they're calling it the European.
Don't buy into it. It's pretty weak.
Exactly.
I can talk about that as well, but that's exactly what I'm researching at the moment. It's the so-called responses to the BRI. So. Yeah,
and I think The Economist was especially not very kind to it.
No.
Basically, the question I'm trying to get at is, should other countries, the EU, United States, and other actors try and come up with their own BRI, even though the European Global Gateway is definitely not even close to the BRI in terms of scope and scale? Should they try and come up with their own versions of this, or is there a better development method that can help both the developing countries and the donors?
Look, I mean, the first point to say, it's a great question, by the way. So the first point to say is that when recipients have options, generally they can do better. I mean, one of the reasons why the BRI has been, at least initially, well received by a lot of countries is because at that point, very few organizations or countries were helping developing countries finance their infrastructure needs. A lot of developing countries have issues raising debt in the private sector for a variety of reasons, and multilateral development banks have, they can't close the gap, and therefore there's a big need. I mean, everyone knows that a lot of countries are in need of various forms of infrastructure, and China stepped into the breach. But as we explain, not so much in the book, but in the report that we published in Chatham House last year, what drives this stuff is actually China's own crisis of overcapacity that's been building up for quite a while. So that's excess industrial capacity, labor capacity, and excess capital, just money looking for something to do with itself, that's been building up for quite a while. And China's own domestic problems, they have a growing problem. I'm sure many would have heard about the way in which the construction sector in China is going, and so the profitability within China is not actually that great. And this excess capacity was building up for a variety of different reasons, including the interests of this capitalist class that I mentioned before, which is rather fragmented. And a lot of it is based in particular provinces, and each province wants to do its own thing. So there's all this capacity building up, a lot of steel, a lot of concrete, a lot of, everything, and workers and the whole lot. And there's just no profitable projects within China, or very few. So internationalization of this is actually a strategy of dealing with this problem. And this is where the Belt and Road Initiative came from. Okay, what do we do with this? How do we keep these state-owned companies working in the context of all these problems? Okay, so the response that you get to the Belt and Road Initiative actually reflects the way in which the West writ large. I'm excluding Japan from this because Japan does things quite differently. But if you think about the European Union and the United States, the recent coordinated Build Back Better World initiative, B3W from the Group of 7 meeting, what they're trying to do is actually, again, reflects the kinds of political economy that you get in the West these days. So we've had underinvestment in infrastructure in a lot of countries in the West, especially say in the United States, going back for many years. So they don't have that excess capacity to export like in China. They just don't have it, right? I mean, so you don't get that push, that pressure to internationalize. But what they do have is a lot of capital looking for something to do, just a lot of capital. Increasingly, a lot of it is what we've known for a while as institutional investors, pension funds and all these kinds of people investing often in very large capital pools. And often a lot of that money is invested in what they call passive investing. So not active investing where you pick winners and losers, but passive investing shaped by a particular index or whatever it may be, okay? So there's all this capital and it's looking for something to do. So policymakers in the West, they don't actually direct capital in the way they do in China, but they are trying to help it find some return on investment. So people came up for a while now. Actually, the World Bank and also the G20 for a while have been talking about how about. By the way, there is a storm coming in here, so if you're going to hear the lightning and thunder in the background, well, you're not going to hear the lightning, but if you hear thunder in the background, that's what it is. It's a subtropical place, so we get these summer storms. Anyway, so they have all this capital. So someone came with the idea saying, okay, how about we get these institutional investors to invest their money in developing countries, right? And get them to build the infrastructure because, they've got all this money right there. But that's actually not working very well at all. These investors don't want to invest in developing countries' infrastructure for a variety of different reasons. And when they do invest, they invest in a very small number of countries, usually middle-income countries or upper middle-income countries. And generally, they invest in a very small number of sectors. Generally telecom and energy sometimes, but generally telecom. So actually, this is not really competition with the Belt and Road Initiative because these investors don't want to finance the kind of projects that the Belt and Road Initiative has been financing. So that's why I think that this idea that this is like a real competition with the Belt and Road Initiative is a bit of a furphy as far as I'm concerned. It's the they're just fundamentally misaligned. So you might get investment in other areas, in other sectors, but I don't think it's going to come in and provide a genuine alternative. And where investors are going to be happy to pick up the slack, it's probably going to be likely in sectors where they're already investing, right? Rather than things that they wouldn't be investing in otherwise. But the problem now also, and this is kind of a sidestep, is that China itself is reducing the scale of its international investment in other countries' infrastructure, because they've just had a lot of problem, especially since the start of COVID-19, with recipient countries struggling to pay. I think Kenya was actually involved in one of those recently as well, if I remember correctly, in relation to your train line. Although China has a real need to internationalize, there is only an extent to which they can do that if countries can't repay the debt. And even though people talk about debt trap diplomacy, that it's intentional, actually it's not intentional. And generally, when countries can't afford to pay back the debt, what you see happening in most cases is actually the debt being rescheduled, which is exactly what happened in Kenya, rather than the assets being repossessed. So this is what some people have called as a creditor trap rather than a debt trap. That was a very long answer, but hopefully you got what you wanted.
Yeah, actually, it touched on some of the things I also wanted to ask, especially about the debt trap diplomacy, especially with Sri Lanka, which kind of became the rallying call for everyone who was already suspicious of Chinese investments in Africa and other developing countries. So especially in Sri Lanka, I think, the fact that Sri Lanka wasn't having problems with Chinese debt, but with Western debt kind of explains, because I was looking also into Zambia, which I think last year defaulted on its debt, and everybody started pointing the finger to China. But when you look at the debt that it actually defaulted on, it was on its Eurobond debt, not on its Chinese debt. So maybe the entire thing I'm trying to understand with is that China has this BRI initiative, which, fragmented as it may be, even the president has pushed for it and all that. Why is the communication around it so terrible, such that when it comes to now the narratives that have won out, the BRI has now become so stained in debt trap diplomacy and all that? But when you look into the actual facts and figures, you find out that things are not the way they have been portrayed. So why is China struggling in trying to get the message out that this is not a debt trap diplomacy initiative?
Yeah, look, I mean, on the one hand, the way things are being portrayed is not necessarily how they work. But on the other hand, actually, they don't work very well at all. I mean, the governance of the Belt and Road Initiative is quite poor. We have seen a lot of projects emanating through quite ill thought out processes, shaped by very narrow interests, driven by companies really keen to get projects done. The policy banks that are responsible for financing these projects have very little capacity to actually know whether they're financing a good project or a bad project. So there were actually a lot of bad projects being financed and built, bad from a variety of different perspectives, in terms of environmental and social standards, labor standards in some cases, also in terms of just the capacity to repay the debt. A lot of due diligence was not happening. So these are all real issues, okay? And the problems for the BRI stem from these problems, right? Because there's so many problems around the place that it did create some kind of a backlash, and increasingly countries have become more reluctant to borrow money from China. But it doesn't mean that there is a strategy of debt trap diplomacy, which for those who advocate this perspective, what that means is that there is someone sitting in Beijing and saying, I'm going to build a train line in Kenya, okay, because I want to get the Kenyan government to default on that debt, and then I want to take it for myself. That's not what's happening, okay? Or the port in Sri Lanka, someone sitting in China and saying, hey, I'll build this port in Sri Lanka, and then we can take it for ourselves. Oh, can you hear it? that's hopefully the electricity keeps going anyway. So that's what's happening in the BRI. This is not a well-planned debt trap strategy. This is just a lot of mess that creates a lot of headaches. And that is the reason why I think the BRI has begun to get a bad name. So I'm not saying that the BRI deserves to be lauded because of all these different problems, but at the same time, this is the point that you made before, that, you know, the quote that you read before. It means that instead of rejecting it completely, just saying, oh, there's some kind of nefarious strategy at play, we just need to reject it. And given the need out there in the world for infrastructure financing and really important projects in some cases, other countries, governments, organizations, civil society, they'd be better off actually trying to make the Belt and Road Initiative better rather than actually trying to replace it and engage in and trying to completely undermine it. I don't know how easy it would be to do that, by the way, because the drivers of the Belt and Road Initiative, as I mentioned before, are going to make it harder to make it better, okay? But it might be a worthwhile endeavor if you can do it, because the financing is often useful.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so maybe just, I think that goes back to the issue of transparency around some of these initiatives, that so much is in the dark that speculation sometimes wins over actual reality. For example, in Kenya, and I think recently in Uganda, where
the airport, definitely,
exactly,
where the airport,
exactly, so there's the Chinese, the Ugandan governments are saying no, there's nothing like that, and you have all these reports coming up. So sometimes it becomes difficult to say what is real and what isn't. So maybe now let me just go to Chinese foreign policy, which you touched on, and I've seen a common theme in your reports and also in the book, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs usually is second fiddle to other institutions.
It's not second fiddle; it's 50th fiddle.
Yes,
it's down the very back, you know.
Well, that might explain, but Chinese
sometimes not even playing.
It might seem so, because for example, when it comes to the South China Sea, which your book also touches on, if you look at the region, China doesn't seem to have many allies, and the ones that are its friends, they keep having arguments with. I'll give an example of maybe the Philippines. During the Duterte years, you kind of saw Duterte moving towards China and even considering canceling the visiting forces agreement with the United States. But then you see this aggressive push into Philippine waters by Chinese vessels that kind of seemed now to make the Philippines run back to the US side. And another example will be India, who, when Narendra Modi was new, he kept trying to build better relations with China. Then you see the Chinese taking very arid and non-strategic land in the Himalayas. So what explains this, what I would consider counterintuitive foreign policy, where instead of trying to, calm the fears of its neighbors, it's actively seems to be causing problems with all of its neighbors? So what would explain that foreign policy?
Look, I mean, obviously you need to look at the specific of each case, but generally speaking, there is an assumption in the literature that all of this reflects some kind of really deep strategic thinking that is going on, and it's all very carefully calibrated and designed to maximize gain. Generally, what we find, actually, that's not the case. By the way, if I lose electricity here, because it is possible, it was flickering before, it's not because I wanted to leave, it's just because that's what happens sometimes. So I'm just telling you. But in the case of the South China Sea, for instance, a lot of the problems that were happening in that region, like I mentioned before, are actually driven from the bottom up. So you had actors, especially the Hainan provincial government, which has an incentive in maximizing Chinese territorial claims over the South China Sea, because it it governs that region, so it would extract benefit for itself if, for instance, fishing was expanded into that region, or even if they found hydrocarbons, like gas, oil, whatever, under the sea. And it went in various agreements with some of China's large state-owned energy companies that were doing some drilling in the region. And then you have the fishing fleets themselves, which obviously they've exhausted a lot of the fishing closer to China, so they had to go further and further out in order to find new fishing grounds. So all of these are drivers of conflict, and all of these interests have a stake in, a more maximalist understanding of Chinese sovereignty over the South China Sea, right? As you mentioned before, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was trying to kind of patch things up, but often quite unsuccessfully. But in recent times, we have seen attempts to try and be a little bit better organized by trying to get the PLA Navy to play a bigger role and coordinate these different interests. That's been partly successful. There's also been an attempt to consolidate all the different Coast Guard's forces into one Coast Guard. That has also been partly successful. But one of the results of those activities, and this is since Xi came to power, and especially over the last few years, is that we have seen a toning down of the number of incidents on the South China Sea. Although the overall Chinese position is sort of aligned around a more hawkish perspective on the South China Sea, and we argue that is largely due to these bottom-up processes, but in general, you find fewer incidents now in the South China Sea. But to some extent, the damage is already done, as you said before. So a lot of neighboring countries are very suspicious, and they have engaged the United States in the region more than it was engaged before. Now, people can say whatever they like, but for the United States to become more directly engaged in the South China Sea, I consider that not to be a Chinese success, okay? Any way you look at it. And that indicates not a very sophisticated way of operating in the region. And we explain that through the processes that I was just describing. So yeah, I think what you said before is fundamentally right, but I think the state transformation approach, as we explain in the book, can give you a bit of a sense of why these things are happening.
Yeah, and finally, before I hand over to Latif, one key thing is the role of the current president, Xi Jinping, who many would see as a very centralizing figure in China, sort of, close to a Mao Zedong kind of figure, who kind of now gives out edicts to everybody and then they carry them out. And in this, allow me to also quote you once again. We seek to surmount this binary framing wherein power is seen either as entirely dispersed or entirely centralized, and another one that reads, the idea that she can single-handedly direct these individuals, take all decisions of any importance, or control in detail the party state's outputs strains credibility. Many Chinese officials openly admit this. One group of experts told us lots of Western analysts think President Xi says, do this, and everyone does that, but that is not true. There's still controversy. One strong man cannot change all that. Now, if you look at that quote, it does seem to strain credibility, but at the same time, is there now maybe a push towards more sort of a centralizing stance, away from the confusion, the fragmentation, or is that just something that we see in the headlines?
Again, a great question, and we dedicated a few pages in the book, in chapter 1, to discussing the issue of Xi Jinping's leadership specifically. And the reason for that is because, we presented this work before the book was completed, as academics often do. We presented it in dozens of different places, and we got different responses, but one of the responses that we often got was, yeah, you're telling a great story here, it's all very interesting, but that was before Xi. This is, previously it was right, but it's not right anymore. Okay, so you're sort of behind the times, and we wanted to make sure that we put in a direct rebuttal to this perspective, because we don't think that it's correct, that it used to be, but it's not anymore under Xi. So there's no doubt that Xi Jinping is a far more assertive Chinese leader that we've seen in a very long time, and there's no doubt that he has acted diligently to strengthen the party's role within a number of different processes and institutions in the Chinese party state to increase his capacity overall to direct how the party state works. There's no doubt about that. However, the way in which he operates is broadly through the Chinese party state coordinating mechanism that I described before: ideology, leading small groups, statements, discipline, all that kind of stuff. The party state is still organized in the same way that it was organized before, broadly speaking, but he is trying to more forcefully exercise his power through these coordinating mechanisms. And the outcomes of that remain basically explicable through the framework that we provide in the book. It's not the case that Xi Jinping still that controls everything that's happening in China, even in really important areas of policy, and even sometimes when he's trying to stamp his authority on what is going on. I guess the easiest example for that is the Belt and Road Initiative itself, right? The Belt and Road Initiative is Xi's signature foreign policy, and still all these issues that we discussed before are evident there. But you can get some really fun and kind of quite silly examples of how these things work, you know. So for instance, in the book, we talk about Xi announced a toilet revolution, you know. So he said, Chinese toilets need to be better. Okay, we need to have better toilets in this country. And then that turned into a whole thing where, you know, everyone was jumping in to try and get funding in order to, and then it became a bit chaotic, and in the end it unraveled basically, right? So you get a lot of those kinds. So it ranges all the way from really key issues all the way to kind of really kind of funny stuff that's going on. We saw that recently also with, I don't know if you know that China had a lot of issues with power generation because essentially, as is often the case in the Chinese party state, the leadership issues instructions that are contradictory. So on the one hand, they said, we want the environment to improve, so you need to use less coal. On the other hand, you know, because I don't know if people in the audience would know, I don't know if you visited China, but the air quality in a lot of Chinese cities is very poor. I think power generation and so on is a part of that. You know, there's a lot of kind of dirty stuff, dirty factories, dirty power generation going on. So say, okay, use less coal, we're going to green up our cities, okay, clean up the air and all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, they're saying, well, you have to maintain economic growth. Okay, so you gotta keep the economy going, you know. And they're different administrations and they're doing different things. They don't really talk to each other. So for a long time, the kind of environmental people, which increasingly became more powerful, were saying, you got to use less coal. You have to use less coal. And the provincial governments and local government just ignoring them. You know, just they're saying this stuff, they're just ignoring. We don't care. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. At some point, it became a bit more serious, and they said, look, you have to do this now, or I don't know, you're going to get into trouble. We're going to discipline you. So then they, you know, as is often the case, sort of panicked, started using a lot less coal. Then China had a series of rolling energy blackouts and all sorts of problems that had a very serious impact on industrial output and on economic growth. Suddenly, the economy is starting to get into real trouble, also because of the pandemic and all sorts of problems that a lot of other countries are facing. So then there was a rush in the other direction, saying, no, turn everything back on. We have to get growth again. You know, we have to get the electricity running again. So that's how a lot of things work. And this is all recent. This stuff happened this year. Okay, I mean, Xi Jinping has been in power now for nigh on 9 years. So clearly a lot of these issues have not been resolved. That's just one example.
Yeah, thank you so much. Latif, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so thanks so much. I think for most of what the discussion has been about, it looks like my questions will also build on that. And it's a very interesting discussion because we are touching on how China has been dealing with itself internally and also externally. So in that same strain of thought, I wanted to ask more on the issue of the drugs. One of the things you talked about is how there's a lot of strategies towards drug controls and narcotics. And this is now in contrast to what China and the US is doing, whereby a lot of drugs in China are being transported to the US. And so they also have strategies on how to control these drugs. But at the end of the day, you realize that these parties that are trying to control the drugs are also the same parties who are fighting with the US on other trade-related issues and how they're going to have the policies around trade. As a future trend, although this is kind of distorted seeing as how China is there a future trend we can see towards how there could be more symmetry in China's relationship with the US, in that they're trying to have strategies to help each other, but on the other hand, they're fighting for more economic market share, I would say, in the global sector, and how that can affect the relations within now China as a state and the state parties.
Yeah, thanks. So in relation to drugs specifically, I don't know this area particularly well in this context, but I know that Chinese exports of fentanyl, especially opiates, a big part of the problem in the United States. But I'm not familiar with the specifics of exactly what the US government or the Chinese government have done in this respect. I know that the US government has complained about it quite a lot, you know, but I'm going to have to leave that for, you know, those who are more familiar. But in general, what we're seeing in the China-US relationship, obviously is a more fraught relationship where the kind of areas of collaboration and cooperation are getting smaller. Although we have seen some pretty serious cooperation recently, especially around the COP26, you know, climate change summit and subsequently. So that's quite interesting. But when it comes to the economy, essentially what we're seeing is two things. So on the Chinese side, China has been keen to avoid the so-called middle income trap. And that is where a country, economists talk about that a lot, but it's where a country reaches a certain level of development on the basis of having relatively cheap labor. But then the investment in factories in that country shift to other countries that have cheaper labor, and they sort of get stuck there. They don't really, you know, progress. So the Chinese government has tried, again, using the very similar sort of fragmented, decentralized mechanisms that I was describing before, to develop an industrial policy for China, to put it up the top of the ladder in terms of technological development in a number of important fields like artificial intelligence and all sorts of things like that. Okay, so they're trying to make sure that they push up the ladder and they don't get stuck in that middle income trap, that they get higher value added stuff happening inside China. Now, a lot of that stuff started to spook the United States government for a while now. It sort of came to a head a bit with Donald Trump because of Donald Trump's particular obsession with trade surpluses or, you know, export and so on, which is actually a bit of a silly position, but nonetheless, you know, so the trade sanctions emerge out of that. But for a while now, a lot of people in the United States, and it's not just the kind of crazy Republicans, but also Democrats, they've been a little bit uncomfortable with what's happening with China's rise. And we can see that the Biden administration essentially continued the exact same policies pretty much with very minor tweaks. And that is because they're concerned that this industrial policy in China is going to allow Chinese companies to overtake American technological companies and, you know, and also give them an edge in terms of exporting to other countries and whatever else that means in terms of security and so on. So the United States government has been trying in a variety of ways to prevent that from happening. And one of the ways in which it's happened, it's an argument that I don't know if people here are familiar with the work of Henry Farrell and Abram Newman, but a concept that they conceived, weaponized interdependence. So the United States sits in the middle of a lot of networks, and the government in the United States or different agencies are exercising their central location within these networks in order to undermine, you know, China's capacity to develop these technologies. So we've seen, for instance, companies like Huawei or, you know, very large Chinese technological companies being prevented from working with American technologies, American companies, and it did have a very significant impact on Huawei. I don't know if the impact is going to be long term, but in the short term, they had to create their own operating system out of scratch. I mean, these are very complicated things to do. They had to find their own supply chains for a whole range of different things, and they lost a lot of sales consequently, very substantial decline. So it does have an impact, but that is, I think, where we're heading. I think those issues in trade, given how integrated trade is, around global value chains, most things these days are not made in one country, they're made across a lot of different countries. So I think those tensions are going to potentially restructure global value chains to some extent in the future, but not across every area, like in particular areas where there are these sensitivities. Because actually the pandemic so far has not led to the diversion of trade out of China. In fact, it's done the other way. It's gone the other way. So Chinese exports have actually increased. And we're not seeing real divestment yet from China. But when it comes to these more sensitive industries, I think that this could have an effect in the future. And all I can say, we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe, I know we have about 10 minutes, so we'll do a quick fire round of questions. And I hope people in the audience, if you have questions, please raise your hand and I will just call on you. Sorry, is somebody unmuted? Okay, so maybe there was this quote that approved BRI projects follow the logic of economics, not of geopolitics. And one thing I think that I also got from your report and from the book was that many of these BRI projects tend not to generate profit. For example, a good example will be the railway in Kenya, which, forget profit, has never even broken even. Another would be the Sri Lankan port. So if the logic is economics and profit seeking, why do they keep going for these projects that tend to be white elephants and do not really generate any profit?
Well, it really depends on the structure of particular deals, right? Because if the deal is just to build something, then the company building that thing doesn't really care what happens after. Okay, they just build it, they get their money, and they walk away, and then it becomes the problem of the company operating it, which may be even controlled by the government of the recipient country. I'm not sure what the situation is for the Kenyan railway, by the way, but that's what often happens. Some projects are what they call build, operate, transfer projects, and there the companies do have a skin in the game. So they go, they build whatever they build, and then they operate it for quite a while, and then they essentially give it to the recipients at some point. With these kinds of projects, generally, it is the company that takes on the debt, not the government, okay? So the company takes on the debt, it does what it does, but it makes money from the project itself. So in those situations, the company does care if it's a white elephant or not a white elephant. However, most of these, you would think that they would care, but in reality, what often happens is that companies, and sometimes via the Chinese government, have negotiated various forms of sovereign guarantee that actually greatly reduce the risk to them from a project being a white elephant. So sometimes, in one case that we have in the book, we're talking about a hydropower dam that the Chinese built in Cambodia. And that dam, feasibility plans for decades. I mean, the plans existed for a long time, but for a long time, the feasibility plan said don't build it because it's not economically viable, because the flow of the river varies too much between the dry season and the wet season. And consequently, you're going to have a very significant shortfall in your output during the dry season. Okay, so you can't make a lot of money because you can't supply a lot of energy, right? Oh wow, that was quite a thunder here. I think it's right overhead right now. Yeah, so in this particular case, feasibility studies for a long time don't build it, but the Cambodian government really wanted it built. And then a Chinese company built it, okay? And they did do it via build, operate, transfer model. But the guarantee that they got from the Cambodian government is really quite serious. So basically, the Cambodian government said that they're going to buy a certain amount of electricity from them, even if they don't produce it. So that protects their bottom line. Now, how did they get that deal? No one exactly knows because, I mean, these are kind of very opaque processes. But my understanding is that it's basically because the Cambodians really, really wanted it done, and the Chinese company said, well, if we're going to build it, it's risky, and that they're the conditions. And then it was signed into an agreement by the Cambodian National Assembly. So it's actually kind of signed into law, if you like. And they can't really lose. They got this sovereign guarantee. Now, technically, you can say, well, the sovereign guarantee could be annulled, but presumably there's some kind of a clause there that says that something or other will happen if it is annulled. So that's how they try to cover themselves, even when they do a BOT project. But if it's the sovereign government, let's say the government of Kenya, borrowing the money, and they're the ones engaging a Chinese company, they're not directly engaging, but they're borrowing the money so that the Chinese company could build it, then the risk is actually all taken by the recipient, because they're just building it, they're providing the service, and then they're going away. So you have to look at the details.
Yeah, and finally, I would like to just go back to the issue of foreign policy. And now we've seen something called the wolf warrior diplomacy coming out of China. And, for example, when Australia said, let's have an international investigation on the origins of COVID-19, the reaction from China was very, very strong, stronger than one would have expected. And it's not only with Australia, but with many other countries where you see, diplomats who usually are the people who speak nicely and carry a big stick, maybe, are now very, very, how do I say, harsh in the way they speak to other countries, sometimes even undiplomatic. So maybe what would explain this shift? Because if you go back maybe 10 years or even 15 years, Chinese diplomacy was quite different, if not in if not in the content, maybe in the way they spoke to the rest of the world. So what will explain this shift and this wolf warrior diplomacy?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I mean, I don't know exactly what's happening in the inside corridors of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but I suspect, and this is the impression that I'm getting from other things I've read about this, that essentially what we're seeing is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs trying to kind of read the tea leaves and see what the prevailing political winds are and, where they're going, and try to accommodate themselves to that. And I think they get the sense that a more aggressive, some may call assertive, I would call aggressive international stance is what the leadership wants. And maybe that's to some extent what they do want, because I don't think they get disciplined for speaking like this. Then that's what they're doing. But it's, I think, more directed domestically rather than internationally. I think it's a reflection, I guess, of the way in which the leadership, maybe the ministry itself, wants to present itself to other constituencies or stakeholders within China, because it has absolutely not served China's international objectives. This line of diplomacy has been entirely counterproductive. I struggle to think of one example in which it's played well. In Australia's case specifically, it was followed, and again, the origin of some of these things is rather murky, but it was followed by a number of different kind of trade sanctions, restrictions, all sorts of things were going on there for a while, still going on. Really murky. Some of them are kind of informal, that have had a significant impact on the capacity of Australian companies to export certain goods to China. But that didn't lead to the Australian government changing its position. Far from it. In fact, it only hardened the Australian government's position. And Australian companies have managed to find alternative markets to all of these different products. So actually, exporters here were not impacted by this at all. In fact, what happened was a substitution. So instead of buying from Australia, they're buying from other countries in China. And then the Australians are exporting to the countries that used to buy from other countries. So it's kind of just, it did a little kind of, a little dance. But ultimately, the exporters here were not really impacted by that at all. And the reason for that is because ultimately the one product that could really make a difference to Australia is actually iron ore, because that is about 50 or 60% of Australian exports to China. But China has no substitute for Australian iron ore. I mean, there are talks about, I don't know if you know, the big mine potentially being developed in West Africa. But that's been on the cards for a very long time, and it's very far from being developed. It's a very, very long way away. So ultimately, this is an area where, the stuff that didn't have a substitute, basically they kept, and the stuff that did have a substitute found other markets, in a nutshell.
Yeah. Maybe Latif, you can now ask your question, and then I will ask Okumu's question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things that would be interesting to understand with the fragmented way that the states of China or China is more in understanding what would be the external or political and economic shocks that could significantly lower the rise of China in terms of the way they deal with now the issue of the debt trap or the credit trap, as you mentioned, versus how their relations with the South China Sea are in terms of how aggressive they are to countries like Taiwan or any other countries. And they are building this military islands, I would call them. So with this in mind and the way they are supporting North Korea, which is always in that disagreement with South Korea, what would be the impact of that on their own rise to power, and how susceptible are they, I would ask, in terms of the external political and economic conditions?
Look, I mean, if I get the question right, when you have domestic problems, often there is a tendency to try and externalize it, sort of create problems somewhere else and shift attention. So maybe that could happen here. I can't say for sure. But China's had a very long-term problem with its growth model. I mentioned that briefly before. The Belt and Road was an attempt to address that, but it hasn't worked very well. So China for a long time now has been growing initially on the back of exports combined with very large-scale infrastructure projects. And then increasingly after the global financial crisis, exports dropped off as a share of GDP and are not driving economic growth anymore. So fixed investment stepped in a major way in order to address that problem. And then debt levels went through the roof. And now we're sort of in a position where the way forward is not entirely clear, okay? Now, the new language from China is, I don't know if you've heard of the concept of common prosperity that Xi Jinping has introduced, and that's kind of the new language. So the idea is that they're going to shift towards increasingly domestic consumption to take over as a driver of growth. Now, that's something that Chinese policymakers have been talking about for probably 20 years, and the shift to common prosperity has not happened, and that is largely because of the role of powerful interests within the party state, especially organized around state-owned companies and so on, that are just not that keen to shift wealth to households at the expense of themselves. And what we're seeing in practice at the moment, notwithstanding the language of common prosperity and the reinvocation of things that sound very Maoist, but what's really happening is a fortification of state capitalism. So the state is sort of circling the wagons. The party says circling the wagons around the state-owned companies. That's how I see it anyway, and try to protect them at basically everyone else's expense. Okay, so that's kind of the politics of what's happening at the moment. Now, how it's going to play out in the longer term, it's very hard to say, but that's the kind of domestic political economy context, and it is quite possible that if a major crisis was to occur, that would become a pretext for more assertive, aggressive, warlike international action. But I don't want to speculate too much because it's very hard to tell.
Yeah, allow me to ask one final question by Okumu Polycarp, who wrote in the chat the following: China has reduced funding towards infrastructure projects by almost 33%, owing to reduced benefits from cash commitments to the African continent. Will this speak to the uninformed strategy behind the BRI?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know the details of what's happening in Africa specifically in relation to the BRI, but I do know that the number of loans given as part of the BRI for large infrastructure projects has really declined, but it's been declining for a while. It's actually been declining. It peaked in around 2016, 2017, and since then it's been going down. It's been going down quite a bit since 2018. And the COVID pandemic has made things even worse because so many countries are now facing problems with fiscal problems, which make it harder for them to repay loans. So that is, for me, it indicates not so much that there isn't the need in China to find these projects in order to externalize the excess capacity. I think what it actually shows is that as a strategy of dealing with China's problem of excess capacity, the BRI is very constrained because it is limited by the capacity of recipient countries to borrow money. And a lot of recipient countries just don't have that capacity anymore, right? So then comes, the United States and the B3W thing that I mentioned before, to Build Back Better World. And they say, hey, don't worry about China, because our system, what we're going to do doesn't mean, you won't have to take on fiscal debt. The government won't need to accrue debt because we're going to get private investors to invest in your infrastructure and do it via public-private partnerships. That's what they're saying. But as I mentioned before, they don't really want to do it. The investors don't want to do it. So that's a bit of a problem. But, I mean, again, I think that China is going to struggle to expand the BRI the way it did for a while because there's just no capacity to take on that kind of debt anymore. So either they change the model or they're just going to have to find some other thing to do with their problems, the domestic problem, that is.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think we've come to the end of our talk today. Just a massive thanks to you, Professor. Really wonderful topic to discuss, a wonderful discussion, and definitely a wonderful book that I was able to go through. Now I'll sit down with a pen and paper and go through the details as well. But thank you so much. It has really been informative. And we will be sharing this recording. We'll also be sharing, Matif, I believe, the discount code in all our groups for those who wish to buy the book. And I do encourage you to buy the book and read the report in Chatham House if you want to understand more of the professor's writing. But again, thank you so much. I think I will also like to thank Latif, who organized this discussion. Really wonderful job, and thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you very much for having me. I had a lovely time, and I really hope that we're going to continue our communication and relationship to the future.
Hopefully, yeah.